I'll introduce myself. So besides being the author of Speaking in Thumbs, I'm a Stanford-trained psychiatrist. I'm also the co-founder of Brightside, which is a national telemental health company. And I previously served as the on-site psychiatrist at Facebook. So for many years now, I've kind of worked at the forefront of digital health. And what that means is I've devised algorithms to recognize mental illness through data. But some of that data is structured data, such as symptoms and so forth. But we've also looked at a person's text messages to see if we can recognize signs of mental health in those as well, including recognizing depression and suicidality. So this book actually kind of grew out of a collision of my professional and personal lives, because here I was working sort of to interpret data and what it means in our text messages. I was also at Facebook, where I found that a major preoccupation of my very tech savvy clients was interpreting the meaning of their own digital communications. They would show me a phone and say, what does this text mean? And how should I respond to him? And then just as I took the job at Facebook, my own marriage was ending. My husband and I had decided to part ways. And so in my own personal forays into dating apps, I found myself with this ability to decipher the messages of the people I was texting with on dating apps. I joked that I could make a psychiatric diagnosis in less than 20 texts. And so it was really here at this sort of convergence of big data and big dating, as I say, that I kind of got this reputation as a text whisperer. And what I thought I'd do is talk about just sort of 5 ideas that are in the book, that sort of form the foundation of the book. The first is that texting is a relatively novel language. We only started texting in 2007, but it's very quickly become the major language that we use to communicate with one another, and it's particularly so in our romantic relationships. So, we use our thumbs to swipe into a stranger's life, and then we begin texting with these strangers, and then develop our romances over text. And then finally, we negotiate our relationships over text. One of the things that I noticed as people gave me a lot of screenshots as I was putting this book together was that very deep conversations are happening over text. Very romantic conversations, and even heartbreaking conversations. So much of the conversation that we're having in our romantic lives is taking place. And I would argue that it's a language that our brains are still struggling to catch up with. We don't truly understand the rules of it, and we need to get more fluent in it. And so it's an interesting language because it's kind of exists in this space between spoken word and formal writing. And to some degree, we're inventing it together as we go along. It lacks a lot of the verbal cues that we use in spoken language, of course, but it lacks the formality of the written word too. And so we tend to read into and need to read into things like response time. What does it mean if somebody's left us on red? And we struggle with ideas such as how much room there is for sarcasm or emoji, and how to use, sarcasm or irony, and how we might use emojis in our language to clarify things. And so the book really is designed to sort of help interpret this new language. A second idea in the book that I talk about is that a person's language is really a window into their psyche, and so that the way we use language in text messages actually betrays many things about ourselves, including our big 5 personality factors, our attachment styles. And one of the things that I do in the book is look at this wealth of research that exists at the intersection of language and psychology. And when paired with the computational power of data science, we can take very small samples of writing and correlate those with personality factors. So we can practice what's called thin slicing, and many of you are probably familiar with the concept of thin slicing, but it's taking a very small data set, but it's a representative data set, and using it to extrapolate larger ideas. And one can, of course, only do this if one has a trained eye. And so what I do is teach people in the book how to recognize telltale signs of language that may betray actual big 5 personality factors or attachment styles. we can get into specific examples, but I suspect that that in our conversation with Nina, we'll do that. But just, to point one out, I think even pronoun selection is very important. So when we look at the way depressives text, they use the pronoun I much more often, and use the second and third person pronouns much more scarcely. Whereas people who use more second person pronouns in their text, such as you or your, do tend to be more agreeable and conscientious. And these are, of course, the folks who tend to be better at longer term relationships. And people who tend to use a lot of negatives like no or never, or future tense like will, gonna, or might use contradictions or cognitive discrepancies in their language like shoulda, coulda, woulda, they tend to be less conscientious and less likely to be able to form relationships that are high in trust over time. So the idea here is just that with each text bubble, we leave a little bit of digital exhaust behind, and these texts do contain our personality fingerprints. The third idea in the book is that the text messages between you and your partner actually indicate important things about your relationship. So not only do texts betray aspects of the individual, but a couple's exchanges betray things about their pair bond. So our looking back at our texts can help us understand the kind of relationship we're in, or even create the one we want to have. And I give people ideas in the book about how to look for that, and discuss things like text love languages and the way certain people prefer to be communicated with, and look at the pattern ways in which people might express intimacy or autonomy or trust in relationships, because our texts, of course, can telescope all of that. The fourth idea in the book is that by looking back at our text exchanges, that they also provide a record into our relationship communication, and are sort of, I joke, the electronic medical record of our relationships. So because we have this real-time digital exhaust of our romantic communications, we can go back and retrospectively diagnose where things might have changed in a relationship, gone wrong, or deepened. So it can be a cue or a clue as to when a shift may have happened, or a bad pattern developed in a relationship. And it can even be used as an autopsy after the relationship is ended, to understand what may have gone wrong, what we didn't see, how we might do things differently next time. Of course, as we're going along in relationships, our brains are unconsciously registering these changes, but it is helpful to have the written record. And by using a retrospective analysis of a text exchange, there's a lot to be learned. And this is a tool that I have used with my patients in therapy as well. Oftentimes my role as a psychiatrist is to help people sort of retrace their own stories and to tell a new one. And what better tool than this written record of your own communications to actually shed objective light on your relationships. The final idea that I discuss in the book is that by understanding this new language and mastering it, you can actually become the master of your own destiny. In other words, it will allow you to be more discerning in the kinds of people that you might choose to meet in your dating life, or improve the communication style in your relationship, and recognize certain telltale signs, such as how does a person use humor in their text messages? What does that mean about them? Or what does it mean if somebody is, swearing too much from the start? Or how is a person's stress response? What is their typical stress response in an argument? And how is that reflected in their text messages? So by understanding all these tools, you're able to use your text messages to more adequately conduct all relationships. And that would include romantic ones. But I would argue also that much of our work communication is now happening asynchronously. And so this language has become more in the forefront of all of our communications, and understanding what certain signs mean can be helpful across the board in our lives. Oh, I can't hear you, Nina. something on my end that I don't hear, or
Oh,
there
there
we
you
go.
go. Hi,
Yeah.
Mimi.
Hi.
Welcome. I'm so sorry that I was late, and it's
No,
so
no
nice to
problem.
see you. For those of you listening, I've actually met Mimi once before, and weirdly, we have an old friend in common, but I met her when I was in San Francisco recently, and instantly liked you so much, and I'm so impressed with your book, Speaking in Thumbs. So I'm very, very glad to have you here, and I have a million questions. Thank you for filling the time with your presentation, which I also listened to. Quick question. You just said asynchronous communication, which is a term I've heard before, but I don't actually know what it means. Because one of my questions from the get-go is, how does text really differ from email? Like, I guess we use more full sentences in email, but what does asynchronous communication mean?
Well, I think asynchronous means that we're speaking synchronously, so we're both in the conversation at the same time, and asynchronous implies that the responses are happening at our own time, at our own pace.
I
And
see. So
so
anything,
so
email,
yeah,
Slack.
email is an asynchronous form of communication for sure. I think what's different about Slack and texting is that it feels like more of a back and forth,
Yeah.
but it's happening asynchronously. So like I said, it's email, I think, is a little bit more formal in its style,
Yeah.
whereas texting feels conversational, but
Mhm.
is nonetheless asynchronous and lacking in all these cues that we rely on in conversation, like eye contact and facial expression, body language, and response time.
Yeah, I'm currently not dating. I'm in a relationship of 4 years. But your book made me think a lot about my communication with John. I loved I think one of the most interesting things in the book for me is just the idea that as a psychiatrist, you can identify language and use of pronouns and certain words that give hints to people's personalities. That really interested me and made me want to, it also made me wonder if I or anyone were to force themselves to try and use more words to be a better person or be a different kind of person, would that work? Could that work?
Yeah,
Could that
can
have
you
an
reverse
effect?
engineer this? And I think that's a really interesting question, and one that I haven't seen a lot of research on. We have other evidence of that. So for instance, smiling, just engaging the smile
Yeah,
muscles, you get a little wave of happiness when you do that,
yeah,
which is a reverse engineering, of course, right? Why is that? It's because our smile muscles are wired to our brains in ways that are related to feeling joy and happiness. And so just forcing yourself to smile can actually put you in a better mood, and of course, send out good energy to people, which is likely to result in good energy coming back. And so I think, to your question of, by changing our language, can we change the kinds of communications or relationships we have, and can we change ourselves as a person? Can we
yeah,
become more generous by using more generous language? Can we become more curious by using more curious language? and
yeah.
and I haven't seen research on this, but I would argue yes, that by asking more questions and by telling ourselves that I'm a curious person, I ask questions, my guess is that by using that language, we can actually change our own conduct in relationships, and thus
I
change
would
the
think so.
destiny of that relationship.
I would think so too, by thinking about what pronouns you're using and that you could actually have an effect.
Yeah.
Um,
The,
so
this, the, the interesting thing about, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the interesting thing about pronouns, am I frozen here, or are you
no,
okay
you're
telling me?
fine. I'm
Yeah.
hearing you look
So
frozen.
the interesting thing about pronouns is that, here, I'll stop and start my video. The interesting thing about pronouns is that it also betrays the language of power. So oftentimes there's a power gradient in a relationship, and that can be evidenced through language. If you think about how the CEO speaks, there you're going to use the we pronoun a lot, right? They're not going to be focused on the I.
Mm.
And yet the lower employee is going to be very I focused. And the same thing will happen in a pair bond, where the person who has a little bit less power in the dyad is going to be more likely to emphasize the I pronoun, whereas someone in a position of power will be talking about you, your, and or we. And so it's possible to see a power gradient. Of course, in the best relationships, that power gradient is going to shift. I take a turn, you take a turn, and we have a more equal peer-like relationship. But of course, not all relationships are like that. And so you can use pronouns to have a window also into the power dynamic in your relationship.
That is super interesting. I would think, though, that the person using I all the time would just be automatically more narcissistic. But
They,
that's not necessarily the case.
one would think, but in fact, what typically belies narcissism is possess, like they'll use more possessive pronouns. In other words, there's a sense of ownership over you, rather than so much the I. The I is an interesting word. In James Pennebaker out of the University of Texas has done a lot of research on this, and he calls I the shmoo of words because it can mean so many different things. It is a marker of self-focus, of course, but we tend to be self-focused when we're in a more vulnerable position, rather than in a powerful position.
That is fascinating. I know James Pennebaker's work from my graduate program at Columbia Narrative Medicine. He does all this work on storytelling and empathy and healing. And yeah, he's really interesting. Yeah. So that's something I wouldn't have thought of, is that, so someone in the audience is asking for an example of the pronoun issue. So Anne, what we're talking about is this, I just love what Mimi just said, that the person in more power tends to use the we, you, your, and the person in less power, and you can think about it in a love relationship, but also like in a work relationship, CEO to employee or whatever, the lower person in power tends to use I more. Huh.
I think it's always possible to find an exception to the rule.
Of course.
Of course, general tendencies. But I think if you're scanning back across your text messages with someone and you notice these trends, it can be something to pay attention to, and a reflection of perhaps the power gradient that does exist in your relationship.
Yeah. So I'm curious, are there ways you can really identify a liar or any kind of pathology, and what would those be? And I'm also curious what your personal red flags are in texting, if any.
Yeah. Well, lying is an interesting one, and it's worth saying that if somebody's good at lying, it's hard to detect. And, the FBI, of course, teaches courses on this, one that I've taken, but it is difficult to detect liars, but there are certain telltale traits in language. So liars will drop the first person pronoun. Why do they do that? Because they're trying to emotionally distance from the statement. So when they're telling you something that isn't true, they don't actually feel emotionally aligned with that. So oftentimes the I is left off in a text message. There's also an absence of detail or too much detail, but not the right amount of detail in the description of what's going on. And the detail is often devoid of emotion, much in the same way that there's this emotional distance. So there's a whole lot of like random factual detail without any feeling about what's going on, because in fact, they don't have feeling about what's going on because it's not really happening. So those are sort of two clues to spot a liar. You mentioned red flags and do I have any personal red flags? I mean, I think for everybody, and this is a point I make in the book. The book, of course, is less prescriptive and more descriptive in that
it's full of juicy fun stories and reading text exchanges.
I'm not telling people like what the right partner for you is. I'm encouraging you to think about what the right partner for you is. And I don't think there's one right partner for anybody, obviously. But I would say, what do I look for and what do I avoid? I think for me, I try to avoid any signs of controlling behavior early on, and so that's going to manifest by assumptions, lack of questions, assumptions and presumptions. And then I would say another red flag that I look for is what I call in the book instamacy, which is of course a word I made up, but instant intimacy.
It's a good one though, and what it is right away, and it's a real thing in online dating, right?
Yeah, we've all felt it, right? Where somebody is kind of playing up the level of connection you have before there is really reason to. So there's a presumption of intimacy that shouldn't necessarily be space for that yet. And I think that can be another indication of, it can be narcissism, it can be insecure attachment, or avoidant attachment. In other words, a less secure attachment is to assume that, oh, we're besties now, or that we should be planning our honeymoon after our second date. And so those are things I look out for. I think the things I look for are more openness to experience and a sense of open-mindedness that it can often be betrayed in even things like word choice.
Like curiosity can be betrayed in word choice.
Yeah, well, the big five dimension of openness. Yeah, and so again, the people who are more open will tend to use, in some ways, more expansive language. You know, when we look at word choice, they're more likely to use the words like universe, poetry, folk, together. You know, and so like just words that feel a little bit more expansive rather than closed. And I would say accordingly, if somebody's giving you one word replies or not expanding on ideas, that to me is a turnoff, in the sense
Yeah.
that it probably is a reflection of the way their mind interprets things, you know. And
Yeah, what I think is so interesting about this, it's tricky. I know a little bit of your personal story, which is that you got divorced and, you know, started online dating, and like so many of us at midlife, right?
yeah,
And I wonder, like as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking that I've been through so many of these. I experienced one real liar. I had a relationship with one guy who was really kind of a pathological liar, and luckily it was a short-lived relationship, and I didn't feel kind of in love. So it was, but, and then it was 3 or 4 months, and then he died about a year later. And when he died, I went to his service and learned that he was a huge liar, that like so much of what he told me wasn't true. It was really interesting. And it makes me wish I could go back and look at those texts. I suppose I could try to see what I knew there was something off, but I didn't know the extent to which he was lying. So it's interesting that I
yeah,
fell prey to it. And I also, early on in my online dating years ago, like 10 or 15 years ago after my divorce, one of my first relationships was one of those intimacies things, where I didn't meet him. I made the classic mistake of like texting and phone calling for like 2 months before I met the person. And I felt like I was kind of in love with him. And then I met him and wasn't at all attracted to him,
right.
and had to like back out of this thing, right? These are like classic mistakes we all make. I think, I don't think I'm that, you know, it's that
No,
unusual.
they're absolutely classic. And yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for gathering multiple sources of data, whether that's an in-person meeting in addition to texts, or, to your point, meeting people in someone's life who can give you a corroborative story, right, of what's going on.
Yeah.
But it's interesting on the lying front, because one of the things psychologically we do when we're interacting with a liar is we start paying more attention. When somebody is lying to us, it kind of like raises our antennas unconsciously.
Mm-hmm.
We start feeling like, I have to pay attention because something doesn't feel right here. And so that's also a cue to look at in yourself too, is this idea of when you find yourself needing to pay more attention. And as we
It's
said,
a good one.
the liar drops that first person pronoun I, because they're they're you know, it's back to this power gradient again. Like people in positions of power don't use I, and then liars don't use I, because again, they're paying attention less to themselves and to the external
Mm-hmm.
situation that they're having to manage, right?
Well, it's also another lesson in really just listening to your intuition. Because I have to say,
Yeah.
with this guy, Peter, I kept saying to him, I don't know what it is, but there's something that's just not right here. Like I knew there was something off. Um, and he kept kind of trying to talk me out of it. Like, and so
Yeah.
on that front, I did a good job. Like I did just listen to myself.
Right. And I think that's such an interesting aspect of psychology and relationships, is that when we fall in love, we tell ourselves a story, right? And first it's a story that we just tell to ourselves, and then it's a story that we tell to other people. And it's a story about this relationship that we're building. And oftentimes, as I said, in psychiatry, the work is to look at people's stories, see the stories that they've told, and then maybe help them tell a new story based on more objective data. Sometimes they're, you know, undermining themselves in various ways, but in this instance, it is a matter of like looking at the actual data that's right in the palm of your hand. This conversation exists, we have a written record of it. What better way to objectively look at a person or look at your interactions with them and how to tell a new story? And again, sometimes we only have the luxury of doing that after the relationship's over, but it can be a useful tool even mid relationship to understand, how do we fight? What's my stress response in regard to this person? How do they respond in a, you know, when they're under duress? Do they flee? Do they freeze? You know,
Yeah.
do they attack me? What's their response? And how can I see what the patterns are here? And how can I potentially recognize something or maybe even change something?
No, I think that's really true. I'm just going to hold up the book again for a sec. Speaking in thumbs, I will say that in a lot of ways, it's also a basic, very good relationship book, because it reminded me of all the, you talk about the, what's his name? Is it Gottman?
Gottman,
The
yeah.
5 pillars that are going to tear apart a relationship, right? Criticism.
Well, four horsemen of the
Four,
apocalypse is
four horsemen.
what his moniker is, and I, it's useful. They are contempt, criticism, stonewalling, and defensiveness. So those are the 4 bad practices, if you will. But I give people, I like to try to take a more positive psychology approach to things. I give people 4 good practices to use instead, that they can look objectively at their communications and say, okay, am I implementing these 4 good
Yeah,
practices?
I found that really helpful, actually, because now 4 years into a relationship, as you also talk about, sometimes we're not as appreciative and so in reading the book, I thought, how often am I demonstrating curiosity, patience, which is not my strong suit, like understanding, I think, and acceptance, maybe.
Acceptance, yeah, acceptance,
Yeah,
yeah.
that these are helpful reminders that
They are, and it's interesting to see how texts change over the course of a relationship, right? There was this one data scientist who looked at the word cloud of her text messages with her husband from first date and all the way through to 6 years in marriage. And, of course, the initial texts are peppered with, love and all these sort of, love, date, restaurant, and then it gets into dinner, now, milk, and
why?
right. Well, this is normal, but it's also something to pay attention to if we want to maintain some of that good feeling that we have in the first part of a relationship as we settle into the more mundane aspects of our long-term relationships.
Yeah, it's essential. And I have to say, coming to the end of your book, I did have a little bit of a feeling, well, because you're a psychiatrist and you're dealing with relationships and you're seeing them all come and go. And I did have not a feeling of being let down, certainly not by the book, but by the idea of all these relationships and all these text communications that ultimately get mundane. I was like, oh, this is so kind of, how do you keep the spark going, and can you, and so it's very much a relationship book, looking at how we keep.
Well, and that's an age-old question, right, of how does one balance novelty with security, and how does one balance intimacy with autonomy. And I would argue that these things do sort on different axes, and that one can have a relationship that's high in intimacy but also high in autonomy, or that's high in novelty and also high in security. But it is tricky to do it. You have to be really mindful to create these kinds of relationships. And if we just let things kind of go according to gravity, that's not always what's achieved.
It's not going to happen. Yeah. And how do you feel about the work of Astaire Perel? Because of course she talks a lot about this.
Yeah, and I quote her in the book pretty extensively, but I would say I really like, I really like a lot of things that Astaire has to say, and I think that she's really explored this idea of creating space in a relationship and maintaining some mystery, maintaining some novelty. How do you reconnect with yourself? The way I chose to phrase it in the book, or I'd say the model that I chose to sort of think about, the physical model, is to think of your relationship a little like a tripod where there are 2 eyes and then a we. So you're trying to create a we together, but you don't lose the foundation of your own I in the process. And that's a more inherently stable structure than just 2 people leaning against each other. If you a tripod is inherently more stable when you have 3 legs. And so each person should still be grounded in who they are themselves, but then you come together to create a we too.
Right. And doesn't that kind of speak to ideas of codependency? And I mean, I have noticed that as I've gotten older, I feel like my relationship now, for example, is 2 eyes and a we. It's complicated. It's not easy to figure out. And in fact, I'm arguing for this kind of live apart together model, this LAT thing that people are talking about. And my boyfriend is not quite seeing it the same way, but I feel like that's a way for women our age to manage that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there can be various manifestations of it, whether it's living space, whether it's lifestyle, whether it's language, all of those things are reflections, I think, of the way of our own identities and the way we think about ourselves and the way we think about our lives.
Yeah. Are you in a relationship right now?
Yeah, we talked about this when we when we were chatting at your event in San Francisco. I don't claim to have figured everything out, and not coming from the perspective of,
Who
as I
has?
said, of being prescriptive. It's more that I think there's much to understand
Absolutely.
from these digital communications, and that the texts are kind of an interesting window into a lot of these issues that we're struggling with right now collectively. And one of the things I really wanted readers to have was access to all these screenshots that are, they're throughout the book. You can't get through a few pages without seeing an example of a text message between two people. And as a psychiatrist, I read these all the time, right? People show them to me. They show me their phones and they tell me about these conversations they've had, and we look together at the text messages. And I think there's just so much collectively to be learned from these examples, because we don't often get to see how other people are doing it. And there's so much to learn from this collective knowledge. And so that's what I hope to share.
Yeah, well, you do it beautifully. I mean, I felt like reading the book. It's another reminder. I mean, one of the purposes, I think, of community and of women being able to talk about their experiences and people in general is that you understand how universal experiences are. And reading the book, so many of these text exchanges spoke to me, even if the people seemed very different from me. The tenor, the rapport, the dynamics going back and forth. It's very universal what relationships go through. So
yeah.
It's a wonderful book. My last question for you is, was thinking about you as a expert reading texts. Has this kind of taken over your life? I mean, I know you run a nonprofit called Brightside.
Which is not a nonprofit.
Oh, not a
just to be
nonprofit.
clear.
Sorry.
It's we're a national telemental health company. So yeah, I co-founded Brightside back in 2017, and we've grown very quickly, and not surprisingly, just because there's so many
There's
so
a
much
huge
for
need for telemental health.
services.
Yeah.
And we're now working nationally with commercial payers, and so our sources are covered by Cigna and Aetna, for instance, across the United States. But
and Brightside, so it's comparable to, say, Better Health or all these other.
Yeah, so I think it's BetterHelp, but we offer psychiatry and therapy services. Yeah, and I think BetterHelp is really predominantly text-based therapy. So ours are a combination of video sessions and texting, but there's a weekly video session with your licensed provider. So a little bit different model, but we do use both asynchronous tools to manage people's care, and we also have created these closed loop feedback systems that really, as I said, collect data that help surface in real time to your provider struggles that you may be having as a patient. So like I said, a text message, I think, can betray if somebody's depressed or even feeling suicidal, and knowing that in real time could be very helpful and make all the difference.
I think so too. It actually makes me think about a precursor to this telehealth is the crisis text line, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And I discussed that in the book, actually, Crisis Text Line. So Nancy Levelin, who's the CEO of Crisis Text Line, did some really phenomenal research. She started that company.
I know Nancy.
To reach out to teens who are struggling, and I think by collecting a lot of data, they were actually able to identify some very important, word choice and word pairings. And I absolutely use that as an example of how thin slicing is applicable in this field at the intersection of psychology and language. So for instance, what Crisis Text Line found is that when we think of what are the most lethal words in a text message, what would those be? And of course, most people are going to guess things like die or, kill. And no, it's 800 milligrams and ibuprofen. These are the most lethal words, this is how people tell you that they're intending to do something dangerous, is by a drug name or a milligram dosage, not these other words. And knowing that and being able to pour through a lot of data and be able to recognize, okay, what are the telltale signs, is very important. And I've sort of done the equivalent thing in our romantic lives. What is the telltale sign that somebody is introverted? What is the telltale sign somebody's extroverted? What words are they going to use that are going to let you know that in just a very brief text exchange? And maybe that can help you decide if you want to go on a first date with them.
Yeah, or continue seeing them.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. Well, I want to talk to you more about the telehealth, but I guess we'll do that in another conversation. One of my daughters has just become a therapist, and she's working entirely remotely. Like, it does seem like this is the
Mhm.
future, I would think of.
Well, COVID really, the pandemic drove everything remote just because that was the only game in town. And what we found is that about 80 to 85% of behavioral health services had stayed remote
Yeah.
throughout this. Why? Because that not that much is lost in a therapy encounter over Zoom, and it's not like seeing your gynecologist. You're not going to do that very easily over Zoom, but your therapist, most of the cues are very available over Zoom, and you can form good rapport. I've been practicing telehealth for 10 years now, and so I think it's a great tool. It's great to be able to meet people where they are, reduce the friction of having to get them into the office. And of course, there are big swaths of the country in rural areas where there just are no psychiatrists, and so you basically can serve people that you wouldn't be able to serve if by
Yeah.
offering telehealth services.
Yeah, I think it's extremely win-win. And I've seen it with my children. I wrote Tia in the chat. One of my daughters is seeing a therapist via Tia. Another one has just started doing telehealth, mental health. It's been really great. So I'm a big believer in it.
Yeah.
A question from the audience, is Brightside just in California?
No, we're in all 50 states. Yeah. And you can just go to brightside.com, fill out an intake. We're treating 18 and over right now, but we'll have services we're building out services for teens as well. But for the moment, it's 18 and over.
And so, but back to the question about you being a text expert, are people coming to you from all different, is it just romantic, or are you feeling like this has really taken over your profession?
Oh, I wouldn't say it's taken over anything per se. I mean, most of my time is devoted to being the chief medical officer at Brightside, and I still do work with I work with a handful of clients as well, and I would say it's not taken over, but I think there's an interesting parallel in our work lives. I don't know about all of you, but I spend a great deal of time on Slack during the day, and
all day. I love Slack.
Yeah, well, I love, hate, I don't know, it's both, but we're having such complicated and nuanced and sophisticated conversations over Slack all day long, right? And it's done in these little bits and pieces,
In these
piecemeal
bursts.
responses, emojis, thumbs up, checkbox, sort of all these things are taking place in this choppy way right now, rather than in the boardroom or in person, or and over the phone. Very little of that, much more Slack. And so I think that we've all been probably just as confused in the workplace of like, what is this message from my boss mean? And was this sarcasm, or are they upset, or is it intended to be funny? And I think that like using these tools in the workplace is also, of course, there's a big role for that as well.
Yeah, well, and your point that this is a new language that we're really trying to figure out, and that we need books to help us think that through and understand, because you're completely right. I mean, the subtlety of also when we respond to things. I just had a very funny little argument with my boyfriend where he didn't realize he had read receipt on and he didn't respond to me. And I was like, I know you read my text, it was a classic.
Yeah.
And he was like, I didn't. And I was like, yeah, you did. So these are all just the subtleties of our lives now.
And of course there's read and there's read, right? Opened versus actually digested.
Delivered.
And one of the things I talk about in the book, of course, is like these gender differences that exist in how men and women use language and maybe process text messages too. It's clear men can only handle shorter text messages than women. They get overwhelmed after 360 characters. That's about the average guy's limit in a text message. And if you give them multiple questions within the same bubble, that sends their brain into, I don't know what, they can't respond to them all. So women are a little bit better on this front in terms of communication. What's also interesting is that when there's a lot of texting going on, particularly younger women think, oh, this is great, our relationship's doing so well because we're texting a lot. Younger men tend to think, we're texting a lot, things aren't going very well, so there's a discrepancy there as well. And then even in actual language use, so men use more articles, and they use more noun clusters, whereas women use more pronoun noun clusters. We're using a lot more pronouns in our language. give a woman testosterone and she starts speaking like a man. So this is so interesting that it's
Yeah,
not
what is that?
biologically based, that our hormones are actually driving the way we speak and thus the way we communicate with each other. And so being aware of these differences can be also helpful as you're parsing your messages between you and your partner.
That is really fascinating. It makes me wonder. So when I'm on HRT, hormone replacement therapy, does my communication change? That's really interesting.
Well, presumably you're, if you were taking testosterone, it certainly would.
Which I'm not.
But I think HRT, typically low dose estrogen, no, you're probably just speaking like a woman, you know what I mean? Versus our estrogen levels, of course, do wane with age. But then again, so do men's testosterone levels. So.
Right. Okay, this really is my last question from the audience. How do you do a word cloud of your texts? I have no idea.
Oh, well, that's a question for an engineer,
Verizon.
but so it's not something that you as a user without those tools can do, but they just a data scientist can easily pull that up where they can just look at the frequency. So that's what that means, a word cloud. They'll look at the frequency of various words in a big cluster of messages. And so when you've seen a word cloud, you see one word that looks really big and then all these like 3-4 words that look really big and then all these small words around it. So the big words are the ones that are being used with great frequency and a long history of text. Like you might take a 2-year history of text and see
yeah, I guess an average person, I guess an average person can't do that, but I would love to do that. I think that's what Jillian, the questioner, is getting at. Like, it'd be really
just you just find a data scientist who can do it for you. It would take them a few minutes.
Wow, really?
Yeah.
All right, Jillian, we have to find a data scientist to do this for us and analyze our relationship text. And to the question in the audience, what have you learned about men who almost only send GIFs or avatars? I would say pass personally, unless you like that.
So I'll tell you what the research on emojis shows is that introverts use emojis with more frequency than extroverts do. Extroverts seem to be more comfortable using their words. I like someone who uses their words. I feel like there's a sort of canned aspect to emojis that I know they can be certainly playful and clarifying, but it's nice when somebody can use their own words. And I think the other thing we know about emojis is that the kinds of emojis that people use can also betray personality factors. So agreeable people will use hearts in all of their forms, and more neurotic people are going to use some of those expressive facial emojis like the loudly crying face, or the screaming face, or the weary face. Some of those more dramatic expressions tend to be correlated with higher neuroses. And
that's actually interesting. What's your favorite emoji?
I'm not an emoji user. I mean, every once in a while I'll send a thumbs up, but that's the extent of it. I do not use emojis. And I there's actually a little segment in the book where I joke that it's not easy being a psychiatrist who has to explain to people that you don't always understand emojis, but my teenage kids translate them for me, thankfully.
I don't use them very much either, and I agree. I prefer when people don't use them. But my favorite emoji is the shrug, and I'm not sure what that says.
The shrug is good. The shrug.
I think the shrug is kind of funny.
Yeah, and the face palming too is not a bad one.
That one I can never find, but I often look for. And I use hearts. But I agree with you. My boyfriend never uses emojis, and I take that as a good sign. Like I think emojis are weird.
But the heart speaks to your agreeable nature, Nina.
Well, thank you. I have to say, I have noticed in Slack at work that I just pretty much use the heart for everything. And I sometimes think it must annoy people because they're using like the celebrate and the thumbs up and the thank you. And I just basically, if I like it, I heart it. It's kind of
but I think that probably really does correlate. I don't know if you're generally an agreeable person at work, or if you are the person who will take a stand that's contrarian, but like agreeable people tend to be the heart users in the workplace for sure.
That's interesting. I'm definitely known as being too blunt sometimes, but I think I am generally quite agreeable. So. Anyway, well, Mimi, forgive me for being late at the beginning. I could talk to you forever. I'd like to do another conversation about your mental health work, because it's really, really interesting.
Sure, would be happy to. Yeah,
we'll talk about that another time. But for all of our listeners, the book is Speaking in Thumbs. Dr. Mimi Winsberg, She's Harvard, Stanford educated, super, super smart. The book is really, it doesn't read, it reads like a really smart, I wouldn't even say self-help book, kind of relationship book.
I think it's got a little something for everyone. I think there's a self-help quality to it, but I think that it also, it's kind of both funny and a good discussion of many of the factors we face in relationships.
Yeah, I was really impressed from the get-go. I really highly recommend it. I think you'll enjoy it. And we'll talk more soon, Mimi. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.